You're supposed to count 7 units.
Exegesis. Occasionally I teach Jewish law, halakha. And so when you ask me to think about encountering God through text, my first thought is, yes, that's what I do. Right? That's who I am. And so you'll see that I put together a unit for tonight.
1 minute. Julia, I texted Savina as she's not sure if she's going to be on. She walked into the Berkshires now.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So I think that there's a way in which I think encountering God through text works on more than one level. And that's what I'm hoping to kind of get at in the texts that I chose to give you. There's the level of simply, right, here is a text about a person's encounter with God. Does that text teach me anything about my own encounter with God? Might that text help me think about what it's like to encounter God? I think if you have seen, I think it got sent out, sort of the original syllabus for this class was 2 biblical passages about 2 biblical figures, our forefather Jacob and Moses, encountering God. But what I want to say is because I'm a rabbinics person, because I'm a scholar of rabbinics, I think for the rabbis, it's not just that, the text tells you about a story about somebody's, but the learning text itself for the rabbis is a way of encountering God and a way of bringing God into the world a bit and having a conversation with God. And so what I've chosen, it's a little bit meta, I picked a couple of texts in which the rabbis think about text learning itself as part of our relationship with God. So not just the texts themselves describe encounters with God, but that they describe how God might be present for us when we study together, when we study Torah. But I will start, if you look in the packet, the first page is actually 2 poems about the giving of Torah and the relationship perhaps of 2 different modern Jews from 2 different perspectives bring to this encounter of God and the people Israel. There is a very famous rabbinic story or a very famous rabbinic kind of interpretation that imagines that every one of our souls, every Jewish soul that was ever going to be, whether you were born Jewish, whether you chose to be Jewish, any soul that is ever going to be Jewish was present at that moment at Sinai. So I think in one sense, both of these authors are thinking very much about being modern Jews, but both may also kind of have in the back of their head playing with that midrash. One is by Meryl Pheld. She is an American writer. She is a feminist. She happens to be the wife of a conservative rabbi, so that just sort of places her kind of in the spectrum of Jewish life in America, but very much in Jewish life in America. And the other, as you can see, big and bold, because I just took that from the title page of the book, is Yehuda Amica, who was one of the most famous poets of Israel, died 20-something years ago, I think. Just a very, and I think it's very interesting representing sort of a certain generation of Israelis, and particularly maybe Israeli men, who themselves had a certain kind of Jewish background, and often like maybe they were from families of survivors or from people who were refugees from Europe. They themselves had a certain kind of Jewish background, but came and became secular Israelis, and didn't really pass this on, and had an ambivalent relationship to Judaism. So is there anybody who actually likes to read poetry and would like to read one of the poems for us?
Would you like me to share it, Rabbi?
Sure.
That's on the screen.
Yes. Can people read that enough? Is it large enough? It's a little small on my screen, but if it's okay on yours. Do I have a volunteer speak up or use the hand raising symbol? Yes, no? Okay, I see Marion. You have to unmute.
My brother and
start with Meryl Pheld's poem.
Yes, we all stood together. My brother
This is actually a pretty famous Jewish feminist poem.
My brother and
I actually took this copy from the women's Torah commentary that the Reform movement did.
My brother and I were at Sinai. He kept a journal of what he saw, of what he heard, of what it all meant to him. I wish I had such a record of what happened to me there. It seemed like every time I want to write, I can't. I'm always holding a baby, one of my own or one for a friend, always holding a baby, so my hands are never free to write things down. And then as time passes, the particulars, the hard data, the what, just a minute, and who, what, and when, and where slip away from me. And all I'm left with is the feeling. But feelings are just sounds, the vowels barking of a mute. My brother is so sure of what he heard. After all, he's got a record of it, consonant after consonant after consonant. If we remember it together, we could recreate holy times, sparks flying.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to let these sit for a few minutes, and we're going to go to some of the rabbinic texts, but we'll come back to them and talk about them kind of, I think, in relation to what the rabbis are saying. You'll see that if you look at the kind of the guiding questions that I provided you, they bring these into. Would somebody like to take a shot at Amichai? Yes, Eileen?
The giving of Torah. When Moses sat with God on Mount Sinai and wrote on the tablets, I sat in the back of the class in a corner and drew, dreaming, flowers and faces, airplanes, and embellished names. Now I'll show you everything. Do not do and do not listen.
Okay, I'm just going to let those kind of percolate for a few. But in the meantime, I want to start with, because I'm a Talmudist, I'm going to start you off with two texts from the Babylonian Talmud. They look long, but they're actually not, I think, and they're actually very similar. And so one thing we could do, we could just go through them together. If you'd like to do a little paired chavruta study, we could break up into a couple of groups, and maybe half the groups could do one text and half the groups could do the other. Do you guys have a strong feeling one way or the other of what you would like to do? Anybody?
Maybe hear you first.
All right. Well, so let me start with these two texts, and they're rather similar, but let's talk about them. Okay. The first one is from the tractate called Brachot. Brachot means blessings, as probably many of you know. And this is the tractate in the Talmud in which the rabbis, I think, talk most consistently about prayer, but also about study and blessings. They talk about the food blessings here. They talk about saying the Shema. So interesting, I don't remember what leads into this off the top of my head, but we get into a discussion about God's presence when we do certain things, right? So we're going to start with a rabbi by the name of Abba Binyamin. And he says, a person's prayer is only fully heard in the synagogue. And how do we know that? Right? So notice, rabbis make claims, and where they're going to turn often is text, right? You want to tell me something about God? Let's go to a text. Let's go to what we call a proof text. So they're going to go to a little verse from the book of Kings. And by the way, what is happening in this verse at this moment, where we are in the book of Kings, is Solomon has just built the first temple and he's dedicating it. Right? And there's a big celebration, a long prayer that Solomon gives when he dedicates the temple. Excuse me. And so he says, right? Turn, O Lord my God, to hear the song and the prayer. May your eyes be open every day and night toward this house. Right? In the place of song, that's where prayer will be. What's a place of song? A place where a lot of people gather, the temple, right? Synagogues in rabbinic thinking often stand in for the temple that we no longer have. So where is God going to come and actually listen to us, come and hear us? When we gather together in a place of prayer together, right? That's part one. Rav Ada, oh, that should be bar. I put bat, interestingly, but that's not the case. Ravin bar at Rav Ada said that Rav Yitzchak said, so how do we know, from where do we derive that the Holy Blessed One, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is found in the synagogue? Right, so again, we're gonna go to a text to talk about God and God's presence, right? So what verse have we got? We've got a verse now from Psalms that says, God stands in the divine assembly, right? Elohim nitzav ba'adat el, Edah, and Edah we tend to take as meaning a community, a group of people who get together, right? So, right, how do we know that it's 10 people who pray together? Of course, in their time, it would be 10 men, but we would say 10 people who pray together, right? Again, God stands in the divine assembly. Assembly is 10, according to the rabbis. At any point, if you have a question, please don't hesitate to break in. All right, well, what about, we have 3 people who are sitting and doing what? They are serving as a rabbinic court. And now we have a verse, well, actually, the divine presence. And here, by the way, we're introducing an important word. That word is Shekhinah. Some of you may have heard this word. Shekhinah comes to be in later Judaism, and particularly in Kabbalah, in the mystic tradition, kind of almost an aspect of God. Shekhinah is the aspect of God that is closest to our world, that's sort of the aspect of God that we actually interface with. In rabbinic literature, it's not quite that yet, but it is some sense of the divine presence. Right? So we feel God's presence when 3 people sit together to judge a case by Jewish law. Right? How do we know that? Again, text, we're going to text. And we're actually going to the second part of the same verse from Psalms that we've been looking at. Because it says also, God is amidst the judges, he judges. Right? In Hebrew, Bekerev Elohim, but they're reading Elohim here as judges, which sometimes means Yishpot, he, capital H, will judge. Okay, what about 2 people who are sitting and learning Torah together? Guess what? That also, right? And this is, right, our God through text. When we study together, and what are we studying? We're studying Torah, which may be a written text, which may be kind of an oral text, particularly in the rabbinic period, but we're studying together. So then what happens, right? Then also the Shekhinah comes and is present. How do we know that? Then those who revere the Lord have been talking nidberu dabar to one another. The Lord has heard, right? Do you see that, right? That Lord has heard. The people are speaking Torah to each other, and we'll see in the next source that they really connect that speaking to Torah study. And God is there hearing. And this comes from the prophet Malachi. Now, what about even one person who is studying by him or herself? What about that person? Right? Well, the Shekhinah is with that person too. And here we have a verse from Exodus. In every place where I cause my name to be mentioned, I will come to you, right? My presence will come and I will bless you. So if we're sitting and we're studying and we're thinking about God because we're studying a divine text, or we're studying a text that is a Jewish text, right? Then God will be present. Now we get a very, very rabbinic question. The rabbis say, well, wait a minute. If God is present when I study by myself, Do you even need to tell me that God's present when I study with somebody else? I could have been by myself and God would be present. It's very lovely to have all the rest of you here with me. That's very nice. But like, God would be present. God was present when I was prepping these sheets by myself in my office. Right? Very rabbinic kind of question. Very rabbinic logic. Well, what's the advantage of being two people or more? Then your words get written in a book of remembrance. This is a little bit of a shout out to possibly a passage in Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of the Fathers, be that as it may, right? We're recording this session. When it's more than one of us, it gets recorded before God. Well, wait a minute. If two of us can get our words recorded, why do you need to tell me that three people who are sitting as a court bring in the divine presence, right? If two, then certainly three. Answer, well, maybe when people are functioning as a court, that's not really study. That's not really text work, because what are they trying to do? Their issue is really not to understand the text better. Their issue is to adjudicate the case before them and create communal peace. To make sure that people walk out feeling that they've been heard, feeling that justice has been done. So you might not think that that counts, or maybe God doesn't need to be present for that. No, God is present for that too. And whatever, kind of study of the sources and the text that takes place for that, God is present for that. Right? Last but not least, if God comes for three people sitting in a court, surely God comes for 10 people praying together, right? But when you're trying to pray together, and God actually comes first. God shows up early. The word here is kadma, and kodem in Hebrew means before, among other things, right? Lahakdim is to like be early, to come quickly. So God comes. Three, once you've actually got your three people together, then God will show up. But God waits to see if you're going to get your three. 10, God comes over. Okay, so that's text number 1. Questions? What questions do you have about this text and what it's saying about what brings God and why? Yeah.
Well, isn't the court, you need 3 at the court because you're weighing yourself on questions, and you've got to have 2 out of 3 because
right.
So that there's not a tie. And to me, it's under the Lord, under God, but it's more like judicial more than praying to me, isn't it?
So but that's the interesting point. I think the text of it. So first of all, Marianne has pointed out something very important. When you have a court, it's good to have an odd number of people on the court, right? Even in our own judicial system, we have a Supreme Court of 9. Our federal courts are often 3 or 5, right? It's good to have an odd number so that you never get a split vote. So she's pointing out something very important there. That's why you need 3 judges for what we call a Beit Din, a court, a Jewish court. But I think, I think you've touched on the exact problem that the rabbis themselves suggest. One might say, a court's not really Torah study. That's business. That's keeping peace in the community. But guess what? You're working with the text. You're working with Torah. You're trying to make Torah part of people's lives. I think maybe that's a little extra piece that they don't quite say, but I think that resonates for me. Now you're taking Torah, and it's not just something in theory, but it's something that's actually going to touch people's lives. That surely merits God's presence. I'm going to quickly walk you through the second text Shabbat, because Shabbat 63a, it's a very similar kind of concept. And then I think let's maybe talk about the 2 texts together and maybe look at my prompt question, but then also whatever questions you have. So this is a very similar text. It's a little bit complicated why we are doing this in the midst of Shabbat. Very quickly, they start with a discussion of a man wearing various kinds of weaponry on Shabbat. And is that kind of like adornments, or is that like something you really shouldn't be carrying around on Shabbat? And somebody cites a verse, and the rabbis try to say, no, that verse isn't about actual weaponry. that verse is about Torah study. I think the rabbis do have an idea sometimes that Torah study can be combative sometimes. There is an element of, arguing with each other, fighting with each other over what the text means. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. But so that's the way we kind of back our way into this text. All right, we start with Rabbi Yirmiyah. That's Jeremiah in English, right? He says that Rabbi Elazar said, you have two students of the sages, Talmidei Chachamim, and they are like sharpening each other. They're kind of like like a knife against a stone, or right? They sharpen each other in the study of the law. Then what is God going to do? God is going to bring them success. And they quote this verse that we have been talking about, sort of in the previous passage. It's from Psalms. In your glory, win success. Right? Ride on in the cause of truth and meekness, etc. Right? And they're doing a play on words. The rabbis do this a lot. They like to play on things that sound similar. So they look at the word in the verse, v'hadarcha tzalach, right? Win success. And they say, oh, that actually sounds like v'hidedcha, which is, if you look at the previous line in the Hebrew, if you read Hebrew, two talmidim hamechadadim, right? So the word for to sharpen or to whet, W-H-E-T, right, is chadad. And so they turn hadar into hadad, which is also actually not uncommon in Hebrew, because if you notice, the dalid and the resh, the R sound in hadarcha looks a lot, reshes look a lot like dalids. So you get hadadcha, hidedcha. And then, all right, what else will God do for two people who are studying together? They'll rise to greatness, right? Because the verse goes on, right? Win success, right on. Okay, what if these two people aren't learning, right? We talked with the previous text about sort of, is there an advantage to text learning that actually helps people, that takes it out into their lives? But there's also, the rabbis have a concept of learning you do simply because this is God's word and we love it and it's Torah and we care. They call that Torah lishma, Torah for its own sake, right? So what if you're not learning for your own sake? Oh, well, no, you have to be learning in the cause of truth. I think what they're saying is it's best. God will give you most success and God will be most present if you're learning for its own sake. Okay. What about if you become arrogant about how much you know? Oh, look at how much I know, right? No, you have to have, right? The verse includes meekness and right. You want God to be present for your study? Don't get a swelled head over it. Mm-hmm. But if you do this, you learn Torah with meekness and with proper humility, and you learn it for its own sake, you will get the Torah that was given with the divine right hand. Remember that they live in a world where most people are right-handed. We still do, right? And so the right hand to the rabbis is the sign of strength. I apologize to all the lefties out there. Okay, skip a little more. We have a series of these, right? Of ways that students relate to each other and how that affects the role of God in their study together. We follow that? How you and your study partner relate to each other will affect how God manifests in your study. So another teaching from Rabbi Yirmiyah, but this time he's quoting a rabbi by the name of Shimon ben Lakish. Two students of the sages who are calm. And the word here is nochim. They are calm, they are peaceful, they are gentle, whatever you want to say, with each other in the study of law. The Holy Blessed One listens to them, right? And now here is our verse from Malachi that we saw in the previous text, right? Then those who revere the Lord have been talking, midbaru to one another, the Lord has heard it. And how do we know that dibur means that they are being calm and subdued? Because we have another text that uses something that sounds like dibur, yadber, right? You can see the dalet and the bet and the sort of the d and the b and the r sound. God subdued peoples under us. So Yadber, Dibru means that they not only were they talking to each other, but they were talking in a calm and subdued and peaceful way with each other. And then, right, when you talk to each other that way, God listens, God comes and listens to you if you are kind to each other when you study, which is a little different than sharpening each other, right? Okay, another way you might relate to each other. So it's a new rabbi quoting, but it's the same rabbi being quoted, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, who's also sometimes known as Reish Lakish. You may have heard of him. Right? Two students of the sages who listen to each other when they are studying the law. God listens to them. So another way that God listens to you is when you listen to each other. Right? I don't know, maybe is this maybe somewhere between sharpening each other? Is this somewhere between being, or is this another? But in other words, maybe you're both talking and you both have things to contribute, but you're also right not insisting on winning. You want to listen to your partner, or you want to hear what your partner has to say, right? And they quote a verse from the Song of Songs, which of course is traditionally it's love poetry, but it's understood classically, not only in Rabbinic Judaism, but I think also in early Christianity, for example, that somehow this poem is allegorical and it's about the relationship of God and people, God and Israel for us, maybe God and the church for Christians, right? So God listens to us, he says, you who linger in the garden, the companions heed your voice, let me hear your voice. And I think they're picking up on lingering in the garden, maybe a metaphor for studying Torah. And then of course also, right, we are companions. In fact, the word here in the Hebrew is chaverim. And we talked about, do we want to study in chevruta? Chaverim, chevruta, related words in companionship, right? So, but right, when we study that way, right, the companions heed your voice. We heed each other as we are learning together. We actually pay attention to each other. We're not just about the point I want to make. I want to hear what you have to say. Then God says, let me hear your voice. God wants to listen in. God wants to be present. God wants to be part of this experience with us. Very interesting, right? Our text study together invites God in. All right. Last but not least, right? And if you are not nice to each other, right? What happens? The divine presence runs away, right? Because the very next verse says, flee, my beloved. So if you're not good to each other, God will flee. Last thing that we have in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. This one, it's a little bit unclear what they mean by the word madgilim. The Hebrew word is madgilim, but probably it means to form a group together, right? They get together to study. Maybe because they don't necessarily have a teacher, but they still want to learn. So they get together, or they get together and they find it, right? Like they get together like you guys have, and they find a teacher, or they find teachers within the movement. Another possibility is that they outwit each other, or that they cause each other to err, but they're trying, right? Nonetheless, right? So whatever it means, God loves them. Again, a wordplay, because his banner, diglo, right? So you hear madgilim diglo. Degel, by the way, is the word in modern Hebrew to this day for a flag, right? So I see somebody's got the degel of the state of Israel behind her in her picture. So that's what I mean. God's love is over me. So again, right, all these different ways of being together, learning text together, invites God in. All right, so first of all, just very quickly, what questions do you have simply about the content and understanding these passages? And then maybe we'll open up for a little broader conversation. Any questions about just understanding what these texts are saying?
Is God considered an equal? It's Ellen, Rabbi. Is God considered an equal when God is invited in, or is God?
I think God is an honored guest. I think God is more than an equal. Probably, right? You want God's presence. I mean, there is one version of, right, this word Shekhinah. It is possible when the Shekhinah rests on somebody, that is an idiom sometimes for that person is prophesying. So Shekhinah can be quite significant. So I see a hand. Dana?
Yeah,
Dana?
Dana, as in banana.
Dana. Hi, Dana.
Hi. I just want to say how much I appreciate your going through that the way you did, because I read through it and I couldn't draw out what you did. So it was really helpful.
I was trying to fit each one on one page, and I probably should have put some breaks in, but it wouldn't have fit on one page that way. But yeah, I think rabbinic texts, often it helps to have them, to talk them through. That's a very common thing about rabbinic texts. It's good to talk them through and not just sit down and read them. Okay, Marion.
Is more emphasis always given on a study partner, two people? It seems that everywhere you read a story or see a movie or do something, it's always two people, that the person has to have a study partner. So I've always felt that that was the most significant kind of study that they have shown in the Talmud, in the Torah.
There seems to be for rabbis, and there's a lot of questions about like how this worked its way through history, and was this always the Jewish practice or not? I don't want to get into all the details of that, but you do see rabbis seem to often kind of partner up, and often partner up in what you call somebody, a person has a bar plugta, their argument partner, yeah. Honestly, their disputant partner, and you get these pairs, Rav and Shmuel, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, who we just saw, Rava and Abaye. You get them all over the place. The two people who are constantly kind of rubbing up against each other and challenging each other, and yet often, right, are also close to each other. It's important, and there's this feeling that the learning is more important. Right? There's a famous story actually about Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. They get into a fight. It's complicated. There's a lot more to this story than I can tell very quickly. They get into a fight. Rabbi Yochanan gives Reish Lakish essentially the rabbinic stink eye, and Reish Lakish gets sick and dies. And then, of course, Rabbi Yochanan has his "you don't know what you've got till it's gone" moment, right? And the other rabbis send him somebody by the name of Rabbi Elazar ben Batat to study with him. He misses Reish Lakish so much. He's got to have a study partner. But the problem is that this other rabbi gets there, and Rabbi Yochanan says, I think the law is such and such. And the other guy goes, oh yeah, you're right. I know this text that backs you up, right? And then he says something else. The guy's like, oh yeah, you're right. You're brilliant, Rabbi Yochanan. How about this? Like, I know this text that backs you up. And on and on. And Rabbi Yochanan gets incredibly frustrated. Why? Because he says, I need somebody to challenge me. It's not like whether I'm right or wrong. I think I'm right. I think I will still think I'm right when we're done, but I will be able to demonstrate why I am right so much better and so much stronger when I have that back and forth with somebody, right? You can't be a good lawyer, right? You're not going to get to the level of being a lawyer who argues a case in the Supreme Court if you don't have the ability to anticipate, for example, what the opposite side's going to say and how to counter it, and what the different judges are going to ask you, and so on. You have to be able to handle the back and forth. So yes, I think for the rabbis, having that process is very significant to them. And it seems to bring God in. Okay, I see a raised hand. Sabina has been waiting very patiently with her hand raised over there. So.
Yeah, in between my eating dinner, we just walked into the house. Now, study groups, I know when my husband started law school, he came home the first day and he said, everybody wanted to meet for their study group. He was an older law student, and he was able to answer without being intimidated by the professors because he used to be a teacher. But study groups, you immediately form study groups. You need to bounce off of each other.
Yeah. No,
and
I'm
share the learning.
A lawyer. I'm the daughter of a lawyer. I'm the sister of a lawyer.
And the first thing was
possibly going to be the mother of a lawyer.
And then when my little one was in second grade, she was such a lunatic. She was forming study buddies in second grade and ruling the groups.
Yeah, no. When my daughter was actually doing her master's degree, she would walk into a class and she would kind of look around and pick somebody who looked like a good, sympathetic person and like say, you want to be my study partner for the semester, and made many friends that way. Okay, Denise is also raising her hand.
I always thought that it was encourages us to have a study partner because, well, kind of repeating what you guys said, bouncing off each other, or actually we can explain. There are certain points I would understand and my study partner wouldn't, and we could explain it back and forth to each other. So it just clarifies everything. If we're both reading the same thing, and she has one take on it and I have another.
Right, and you can have a perfectly good and plausible understanding of a text, and it's rare that texts have only one meaning.
Right.
And suddenly, I have this experience regularly as a teacher, and I teach often beginning level rabbinical students, maybe in their first or second year. They haven't really encountered rabbinical texts before. I do lots of stuff like this, working with lay people who may or may not have had background in rabbinic texts. And it is quite common that with all my experience, 20 years of teaching and 10 years to get a doctorate, it's 5 years of rabbinical school, yada, yada, yada. Someone will say something and I will just go, oh,
yeah, yes,
wow.
Yeah.
What a beautiful reading of this text. That's why I love what I do.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that was
because we're all different people.
Yes. Yep.
Okay, so I want to maybe just start a little bit with one of our discussion questions. But again, you don't have to be limited to my discussion question. And Sharon, I see your hand, but I'll come back to you in a minute. So there's this kind of apocryphal story that some famous Jewish studies professor, probably somebody in rabbinics, it's told about various seminary professors. It might or might not be somebody, right? But supposedly he said, right? The prayer was kind of perfunctory for him. You go, you do it, you get it done. What you really want to do is study it, which is a very rabbinic attitude, by the way. I think the rabbis themselves, they spend a lot of time talking about what you have to do in prayer, but really what they care about is Torah study. So when I pray, I speak to God. But when I study, when I learn, God speaks to me. Right? And so I'm not entirely sure that's what these texts are saying, but they are certainly saying that when you study, God is present. The text and learning text together can bring God present. So, any of you, have you ever had an experience of just reading something and feeling like, God is here? And it might be a Jewish text. It might be the text of a prayer. It might be a piece of the Bible, you're reading the book of Ruth this year on Shavuot, and you're just like, I really feel it. I don't know, right? But it could be a Hasidic story. It could be a poem. It could be Yehuda Amica. It could be what's her name? Not Jewish, but she's a very famous kind of spiritual poet. I'm blanking. Doesn't matter, right? But you're reading something, and suddenly you're like, I feel God's presence. Has anybody ever had such an experience? I'll tell you what, I'll let you sit on that one. And Sharon, why don't you ask your question? Sharon, you're muted. Can you get yourself unmuted?
Okay. I think that's it. When I was wondering about forming Chavruta partnerships. We have a Torah study before Saturday service, and we'll often come up with different ideas and interpretations that, I wouldn't have thought of before. But sometimes what we come up with, and, as far as even the main points or ideas, the rabbi, will say, this is good, but this other thing, no, that's not right. And so if we're doing this on our own and maybe being led astray in things, what's to prevent that?
Good. So I think that's a great question, right? It is true, right? There's often more than one plausible explanation of what's going on in a text, or more than one plausible reading. And then sometimes there are readings that simply seem to misunderstand. And I always have sometimes to deal with that with my students. I'm like, no, actually that word you translated as, for example, in Aramaic, the word chamra can mean wine, and it can mean donkey. I was just actually talking about, no, you've just translated that as donkey. And I'm sorry, no, that actually in this context, if you read on and you see what's going on, it has to mean wine. There's a Hebrew word chalav, milk, that is spelled exactly the same as chalev, which is like the fat in meat. Like, and it means it's very different if it means one or the other. So you're right, sometimes you're wrong. So I think what's interesting is if you go to the second text that I just did, the Shabbat text, down at the very bottom, all right, and I told you that there's some different understandings of what it means when these students get together. It's not entirely clear what Hamad Gilim means, but one translation that I looked at said it means that they lead each other astray, not deliberately, but they accidentally lead each other astray because they haven't got the teacher that they need. And even then, right, if we read this text that way, even then God loves them because they're trying. So that's one possible answer to that. All right, so I've asked if anybody has an experience of God through learning a text, like even on their own, right? You know, maybe according to Brachot, one person alone studying can bring God's presence. But also, have you ever had the experience of like just something about being and study together helps make you feel like God is present? Denise.
I don't know if you're familiar with our Machon B'Yachad, but we meet 3 times a week, and every Friday we take turns teaching one of the parshas. And usually the rabbis teach us, but on Friday we're the ones that do it. And it gives for me, it gives me a chance to really get deep into it and read whatever the parsha is. And we teach each other. So that's how we learn them. And as far as I'm concerned, God's present every time we get together. It's a wonderful group. Yeah. But every Friday, that's what made me think about it. That's what we do every week. We've been teaching each other.
Right. So there is something divine, I think, about that.
Yes.
That energy together and that sharing and that using Torah as our connection to each other.
Yes.
Beautiful. Anybody else want to add something in here? I will, at least allow for the challenge. Is text the best way? Is, like this quote says like, oh, when I study, that's when God talks to me. And I will tell you, as someone who does text, I've had those experiences. But frankly, I've also had the experience of really appreciating God's presence. My husband and I went to Hawaii one time, and we got up early to go see sunrise at the top of the mountain. And then after we saw sunrise, we were kind of driving our way down, and we stopped at a trailhead so that I could say Shachari. And the nene geese are honking, and the sun is coming up, and the wind is blowing, and we're on the top of the mountain, and we can see the ocean. God was very much present there, and it wasn't about the text. I mean, yes, I had a siddur, and yes, I was praying, but no, the experience of God there was not about the text. So is text the best way to do this? Is text just a way to do this? What do y'all think?
Lori.
Yeah, okay, sorry.
So in the same way that nature makes us all feel the presence of God more, so does music, right? So is there a lot of any commentary about that? Or
there actually is some. There's actually some very beautiful stories about King David. In rabbinic tradition, King David is the author of the Psalms. Right? And there are some that say, like, this is a psalm of David. And there are others that say, David, by David, a psalm. And so the rabbis ask, what's going on there? And they say sometimes David got inspired. I forget which is which. But sometimes David got inspired. And then he would start to, like he was already inspired and he would start playing his music and composing the psalm. Other times David's like, I don't know. And then he would start kind of noodling with his music, and out of the music, the psalm would come. Is that sort of along the lines of what you're thinking of?
Yes, thanks. That's interesting.
Right. So yeah, so again, right, it's also interesting, right, that here is a case where we have a text about a person encountering God, but the text is about them encountering God through other means other than just text. Okay, Dana again.
Okay. So I wanted to say that I in addition to this group, I'm part of a group that does Musar together. And so that sense of spiritualness that comes in with ethical being and the sense of God being within ourselves. So right now we're reading the book on Judaism for the World by Arthur Green.
Uh-huh.
And I'm
noted author in
finding it
this field.
fascinating.
So I think that's interesting. You're saying that both the text itself, like the content of the text, and also the process of studying it together and applying it in your lives, all of that helps you encounter God. Am I understanding correctly?
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Or feeling God is within us, each of us.
Wonderful. That's beautiful. All right, I'd like to okay, Marion, and then I'm going to go on to my next text.
Well, I think every Shabbat when I go to shul and I sit there and I hear the cantor or Sibur, I think I'm caught up in it, and I really feel the presence of God the whole time I'm in the sanctuary.
Yeah. And do you think that's the music or the words or both?
I think it's both. I enjoy davening, and I love to sing with the cantor, especially singing. I think when we're singing, I really feel a presence there. I enjoy it so much.
Yeah. So I want to be careful because I'm trying very hard, like not to tiptoe into the ground. So, you know, sort of into the territory of the person who's teaching you next on finding God in prayer. But there is an overlap, I think, right? Because prayer is often text.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I want to go to my next text. This is on page 4 of the handout, page number 4. I did not number the cover sheet. This is the page number 4. And this is from a work called Tana Debe Eliyahu Zuta. It's a complicated name, but it's a midrashic text. That means a sort of a more, it's biblical exegesis, and it's also what the rabbis call Agadah, which is just kind of rabbinic storytelling, moral stories, stories about rabbis, stories about biblical characters. It's a little bit later. It's actually somewhat late in it, but it's probably just a little bit after the Talmud is finished. But this is just, I think, one of the most beautiful kind of ideas about Torah and what it is we are doing with Torah, and what it is God wants us to do with text in order to connect to and praise God. All right, so the story starts with sort of the author of this text, who's supposedly, you know, Eliyahu, or the Tana, a particular Tana named Eliyahu, a rabbi named Eliyahu. Right? So I'm walking, he says, and there was a man who came to me, right? He came to me, and he's countering me with heresy. Now the rabbis have a belief, and this is kind of important, that Torah is not just the 5 books of Moses. It's not just what is written down, right? But Torah is everything that we have done with that over history. Everything Jews have studied from it, everything they have learned out of it, all the area that the rabbis actually call the oral Torah. The rabbis start, the ethics of the fathers, right? Actually, Pirkei Avot starts with Moses got Torah on Sinai, and he passed it on to Joshua, and Joshua to the elders, right? And the elders to whoever, and it gets passed down and down and down till you land on the rabbis who are the rabbis of the Mishnah, which is where Pirkei Avot appears, right? That in other words, along with the written Torah, there's a tradition that has been passed along by Jews for generations. And that too is part of Torah, right? But this guy comes to the author of our text, and he says, oh, I know scripture. I know the written Bible, but I don't know all the rest of that stuff. Mishnah is the word here, basically standing in for the rabbinic tradition, right? And he says, yeah, God gave the written Torah at Sinai, but where'd all the rest of this stuff come from? That's not from God. Where'd that come from, right? And so now the rabbi is going to respond to this heretic with what we call a mashal, a parable. It's a story that sort of symbolically, the characters of this story are going to stand in for the message that you want to teach. All right, so what is this like? I'm jumping a little bit. What is this like? It's like a king of flesh and blood who had 2 servants. All right, you hear king, you hear the rabbis talking about king. Who do you think they're talking about? God, right? And so the servants presumably are human beings, maybe Israel and other peoples, maybe, right? Okay, so you have this king, and he has 2 servants that the king loves, complete love. And he gives each of them something. He gives them a gift. He gives them a kav. A kav is a measure. It's like a big basket, whatever. He gives them a basket of wheat, right? And to each of them, and he gives them a bundle of flax to each of them, right? Flax is what you make linen out of, right? And what happens? So the clever one, right? One of them is clever. And you've got flax. What do you do with flax? You make it into fiber and you weave something with it. You make a piece of cloth. You have wheat. What are you going to do with wheat? Is wheat useful just the way it is? No, you grind it. You sift it, right? You do all the things you need to do to make a nice flour. But also, is flour by itself so interesting? No, what do you do with the flour? You knead it, you bake it, you make a lovely piece of bread. And now, what have you got? You put a tablecloth over the table and you lay out your beautiful loaf of bread on the table, right? And so the one who's clever does that and waits for the king to come back. The other one, though, he just preserves what he's got. He tries to keep it pristine, tries to keep it pure, but doesn't do anything with it. Don't touch it, don't change it. The king might want it back exactly the way he got it, right? So after a while, the king comes back and he says to the two servants, let me see what, bring back, show me the things that I gave to you. And one brings out this beautiful feast for the king, this beautiful set table with this lovely loaf of bread on it, right? And the other just brings out what he got. Which one, at least certainly in rabbinic thinking, which one do the rabbis think is the smart one? They've already told you which is the smart one. And what's the metaphor here? What's the parable here? What are they saying? Go ahead. Who's speaking? Sharon, go ahead.
Yes, it reminds me in some services I had gone to, and this is a Reform rabbi, but I don't think it makes a difference. She always warned us we would study Torah and just look at Torah alone. And she warned us not to just go to Torah and make your final interpretations there. There's something missed when you don't go to the Mishnah, when you don't
go to other parts of the Jewish tradition.
And when it's talking about here about, I guess the parable is God wanting us to take what is given us and to make something with us to live. And I thought about it. At first, the first thing it said here is he arranged it on the table, the bread, and then placed the cloth over it. Later, it looked like it was a tablecloth, but the first thing it made it look like it was the cloth over the bread, like making it holy. And so we have to, part of what God wants us to do is take what he has given us and to become holy and reach to him with it.
Right. And God, it is, I think what he's saying is Torah isn't in and of itself valuable. Torah is the materials out of which we are going to bake bread and make cloth and make beautiful tables and serve and right. Torah is materials out of which we should do something. That is part of our tradition, right? Right. And so it kind of, it tells you at the end that in fact, this is what's happening. When the Holy Blessed One gave the Torah to Israel, God gave it to us as wheat, right? To be made into flour, to be made into bread. God gave it to us as flax, to be spun into thread, to be woven into cloth, to be made into something useful, right? And that's what Torah. So again, right? This is, I think, another way of sort of encountering God through text. By studying text, we are doing with Torah what will make God happy, what God wanted us to do Torah. So when we encounter text and we study text, that's precisely what God wants us to do with Torah. That's what makes us beloved to the King. That's what makes us the smart servant, right? So now I want to put one more question on the table. We may or may not get to our last text, which is a very difficult text. We'll see how the time goes. But so here's the question I think I really, in particular, want to ask this group, right? There's a long period of Jewish history. We live in the very tiniest sliver at the end, currently, of Jewish history, right? Long time when all of this textual tradition was cut off from women broadly on the whole, with a few exceptions here and there, didn't have access to this whole tradition and this whole way of encountering God, right? So is it sufficient simply that now I'm a Talmud professor and I learned from Dr. Judith Helpman, who was the first woman to get a PhD in Talmud, and I teach women to be rabbinical students, and I have female colleagues all over the country in universities and rabbinical schools and rabbinic colleagues, and yay, we have all have access to texts, and so now we can all encounter God this way. Is that enough? Okay, I see particularly Eileen, I think shaking her head, probably some others that I happen to notice Eileen, just because of where she is on my screen. Do you want to say anything?
It's never enough.
Just...
It's never enough, because if it's enough, it's finite. You have to keep on going. You might go in a different direction. You might find something different. You might decide, and there might be somebody that you're touching that's going off somewhere. So you want to keep on branching.
Okay, good. Do you think so? Let me ask, what do you think like Meryl Pheld would say about this based on her poem? Or for that matter, right? What do you think Yehuda Amica would say? Like, would he say this is a gendered issue? Or do you say this is a modernity issue? But what do you think Meryl Pheld would say about, like, sort of just, is it just enough that women now have access to the text, or is there something else women need to add? Is there something else that would come from women? Is there something we're missing still?
Meryl Pheld?
Yeah, who wrote the poem?
Yeah, the sparks
we all
flying.
stood together.
No, right there at the very end, it's sparks flying. Sparks fly out into the world.
Right.
It reminded me of, the sparks flying. It required together the women's perspective and the brother, the man's perspective together is needed to create those sparks. And it reminded me of, I think it was in, last service on Saturday, the rabbi was talking about, I think it was out of Mishnah. They were waiting for the rabbi on the High Holy Day to come to service, and they went to look for him, and he was there watching over and comforting a child who was left by the mother to watch over the baby so she could go to service. And it reminds me of this, that, what's important.
Yeah, I mean, what always strikes me about this poem, and I've taught it and read it many, many, many times, right? Is right, the brothers got the written record, the brothers got the text, and the sister, who's the speaker, kind of only has the memory. But what do we need? We don't just need his record. We need to remember it together. And maybe that's text, but maybe not. Maybe there's something that women are going to bring that's more than just text. I guess the other piece that occurs to me here is if you look at this parable in Tana Debe Eliyahu Zutza, if you look at this midrashic parable, it's talking about we get Torah as wheat that we're going to grind into bread and into flour bread, and we get it as flax that we're going to make into fibers. We know about the ancient world, who very likely did a lot of the baking and turning flour into bread.
The women, right? Women did a lot of the weaving and sewing and making clothing. So it's very interesting that not only women necessarily, not exclusively women, but it's interesting that they turn to things, and there were men who were, skilled tailors for sure, but it's interesting, they turn to kind of domestic tasks as their metaphor, when women were often the ones who undertook those domestic tasks. But in the parable, it's the kind of stands in for the masculine learning Torah and turning Torah into something. So if you give women, right, or maybe even other marginalized Jews, other Jews who didn't have access to this textual tradition or who were alienated by it, right, maybe gay men who technically had access to it but were alienated by it, or Jews who didn't have a chance to be learned, right? Do we want to take Torah and make bread and cloth out of it? What else might we make out of it? Marlene.
Oh. Can you hear me?
Marlene?
Can you hear
Please.
me? We actually included this poem from Torah's Women's Commentary in our Sisterhood Shabbat in Cincinnati, because it was the Torah, it was Exodus Torah portion. And we were talking about how women, of course, had to be at Sinai, and somewhere in the feminist readings that I read, it said that the rabbis and the scholars and the sages all knew they had to give it to the women because the women kept the home, and the women were going to transmit and pass it on to the children to make sure that it would be door to door.
Yeah, that is in the rabbinic tradition.
So that was just something that I wanted to share. And I was just thinking about it. The closing line of Meryl Pheld's poem says, if we remembered it together, so all of a sudden it's a twosome, and he's got the text, and she's bringing a woman's perspective, it's commentary, and it's so much better than either one
by itself. Yeah, I mean, I guess the one problem I have with sort of the rabbinic take is we have to give it to the women, not because the women are going to do something with it themselves or like take control of something, but because, well, the women will make it possible. The women will be the enablers. The women will be the nurturers. I wonder, right, you know, what if we imagine that women receive it simply because it's valuable, simply because everybody deserves to have a piece of Torah and to have a say in Torah? What might that look like?
I like that one.
You're coming out.
Yeah, you're breaking up a little bit, unfortunately.
You're breaking up, Marley.
And I guess just the one other thing is, I do want to kind of, I brought Amichai here just to kind of as a reminder, there is absolutely a huge gender issue here, right? In terms of how, you know, Torah has been understood and gendered all through history. And yet Amichai is telling us, right, like it's not only gender necessarily that might alienate us from the textual tradition. Certainly gender has alienated many of us for many years and might still, even as we gain access. But it's just in Amichai, it's like there's other things going on too, right? Like I just love this image of him as the, you know, the inattentive child sitting in the back of the classroom, who's not stupid by any means, right? Who's creative, who's drawing, who's going to grow up to be a great poet, but who maybe like is like, I'm not so interested in hearing that. This isn't what, you know, what resonates for me. Thoughts on that? Okay, do we think we have time for maybe one more text? This is a challenging one. This last one is a challenging one because this one is actually, it works on a whole lot of levels.
You have time.
Okay.
You definitely have time.
But this is another one about God speaking to us through text, what that does for us. It's about transmission of text through time and how it grows, but it's also about God's justice. This is a very famous text and a very complicated not in the sense of like understanding the words on the page, but complicated in terms of all the things that are going on in this story. All right, so we have a story in the name of a person named Rav Yehuda, and he's speaking in the name of another rabbi named Rav, and he says, Rav tells this story. Moses is up on Sinai. Moses ascended to heaven, and right, God is going to give him Torah. Moses goes up for 40 days. God's going to give him Torah. Moses is going to bring it down. But what happens? He finds God is sitting, and he's making the little crowns on letters. If you've ever looked at a Torah scroll, right, you see how the letters have the, you know, the little crowns on them sometimes, the little extra decorative things on them. So Moses says to God, Ribono shel olam, master of the universe, what's going on? Why are you taking it? Why do you need to do this? Why are you taking so long? People are waiting for me. They're waiting for Torah. What's going on? And so God says, to Moses after many generations. There's going to be a man named Akiva ben Yosef. You've probably heard of Rabbi Akiva, pretty famous person, right? There are schools named for him. There's, in fact, we have a Sinai Akiva Academy here in Los Angeles, right? And he's going to derive things, right, about Torah from the crowns on the letters. Now, by the way, we have no actual evidence of Rabbi Akiva having done that, but right, God's saying Akiva is going to find new things simply based on the crowns of the letters. And Moses says, wow, let me see that. I want to see that. And of course, this is God, so God can do that. God says, turn around. Moses turns around and suddenly he finds himself, right, hundreds of years later, sitting essentially in Rabbi Akiva's study hall. And he goes and he sits at the very back. The rabbis imagine that study halls are kind of organized hierarchically. The better, more senior students sit up front, and the further back you are, the more kind of junior students. So, all right, imagine this is Moses, the greatest prophet ever, right? Moshe Rabbeinu, we call him Moses, our rabbi. No one has ever been as close to God. He's sitting in the very back with the lowest level students, right? And he has no idea what they're talking about. Moses, who's going to bring Torah to Israel. Moses, who is the source of Torah. They are discussing supposedly his Torah and he doesn't get it, right? And he grows weak. He grows like he's feeling like, ugh, right? But then finally, at some point, he comes to the Rabbi Akiva is teaching something, and the students go, Rabbi, where's that from? Where'd you get that? How do you know that? And Rabbi Akiva says, it's a law from Moses at Sinai. And Moses feels better. So, right, notice that tension there, right? The Torah is what Moses brought, and the Torah is also all the things we're going to do with it over all these generations, right? And so that even Moses himself might not understand it at all. I will just tell like a little side story. When I defended my doctoral dissertation, one of the people who was on my committee was someone whose work I drew on a lot. And one of the things she said during that process, which is, I love seeing what you've done with my work. And now that I've been in this for a number of years, I see this happening with my work, and I understand what she meant. Right? People do take my work and they interpret it and they do new things that I never even thought of. And it's cool. It's like there's something very, very profound about your work doesn't just stay with you, it goes out into the world and other people build things out of it. So this makes Moses feel better. Right? But so already we've already got a lot going on here about why Moses himself doesn't always understand what becomes of his work. But that's part of the process. That's divinely part of the process. God has built that in by writing these little crowns on the Torah. Okay, Moses comes back to God and he says, wait, God, you've got him. You've got a guy like Akiva and you're giving the Torah through me. Who am I? He should be the one giving Torah. Look how brilliant he is. And now here's the best. God says, no, it is the way it is. You be quiet. That's my plan. My plan is to give Torah through you. That's how it is. Okay, that's interesting. Now comes the real kicker of the story, the really hard part. The hard part kind of, I think, emotionally, in terms of the theology of it, not in terms of understanding the words, but so Moses says to God, oh my goodness, you've shown me what a great Torah scholar this person is. Show me what his reward is for all this Torah scholarship. Now, by the way, this just occurred to me now. Remember also what Moshe's reward is going to be for having been the one who gave us Torah. He's not going to get to go into the land of Israel. So maybe Moses is asking something about his own fate here too. All right. So God says, turn around. Moses turns around and he sees that the Romans were weighing out his flesh in scales. Rabbi Akiva is a martyr. He is killed by the Romans. He is flayed alive. I mean, it's terrible. The stories about the death of Rabbi Akiva are horrific. But he is killed by the Romans, right? So again, Moses goes back to God and says, what? Right? You know, this guy has learned so much Torah and that's how you reward him. And again, maybe Moses is thinking like, what's going to happen to me, right? And God says, that's my plan. That's how it is. That's how the world is. So, right, God is intimately involved here in Torah study. God plans for these people. God plans for all of us to continually expand on Torah. So you think, right, God's got a hand in all this, and yet God allows for somebody like Rabbi Akiva to be martyred. Think about how many, rabbis died in the Holocaust. Think about how many people who are devout Jews die in terrorist incidents. Being a scholar, being, what happened to the God who's with us? What happened to the God who gave us success when we study? What happened to that God? And so we're again, like, what is the text trying to tell us about God? And how does God interact with our text study in this passage? What is this text telling us about God? What's it telling us about Moses? What's it telling us about about text study, right? It works on all these levels. That was a lot to throw at you, but thoughts, comments, reactions. Yeah, Eileen.
Kind of tells us God is God. He does what he wants. His plans are not ours, and we might not know why in our lifetime, or we might, and we just have to take it that this is the way it is.
Yeah. And I think it's true, right? We can do everything. We can study Torah, and the very Torah we study will tell us, right, that sometimes God is beyond our understanding.
Pretty much.
Other thoughts or comments? It's my understanding that we have about 5 minutes or so, and then there's some wrap up. Edith.
Yes, thank you. This passage leads me to what's going on in Ukraine.
Sure. Want to say a little more about that? I think I follow, but say some more.
Well, I try not to question God, but I wonder what he's hearing from me right now, because I'm thinking of those people and I believe they are as sincere as we are, but look what's happening to them.
Yeah.
And
I think the rabbis are not unaware that the world can really look like a very unfair place to us. And the rabbis, I think they grapple with the concept, for example, of free will. I've seen Marlene's question in the chat, right? This is the challenge of, if we want to be humans with free will, that might mean that we use our free will to do horrific things to each other. And how do we reconcile, are we grateful to God for giving us free will? Are our lives only meaningful if we have free will, even though we do horrible things? Or would we kind of like a God who would reward us when we're good? I'm seeing Anita.
It's like Yom Kippur, where written into the book of life or the death, and one doesn't know.
Right. And we say tshuva, tefillah, tzedakah, right? Good deeds and giving charity and being righteous and all those things and being repentant. Well, those ma'avirin at roa gezerah, they avert the evil decree, or perhaps they lessen or they change the nature of the evil decree. We don't quite know what to do. It doesn't feel like the way the world works to say that. I think it's also interesting, right, just in terms of the theme of this class, right, that how do we imagine our reward or punishment? We imagine it textually. As Jews, we imagine it textually. We get written into a book of life. We get written into a book of of death. It's very interesting. We even think about that textually. And, and everything is written, right? What is the scene in that prayer? The scene is God opening the book, right? Like a judge, and looking through the evidence, looking through the records, and saying, I see you did this. I see, it's all on our permanent record.
But then it says, those who will die, those who will live. There's the prayer from that we say also at Yom Kippur time.
Yeah.
Who will live, who will die, and so forth. And so we don't have any say in the matter. It's God. We just have to believe that good will come out of things.
Yeah.
It's just very sad, though, when you can't, whether it was the Holocaust or now in Ukraine, we all question, like, why is this happening? And there's no answer. I think that's been the age-old question our rabbis grapple with.
Stop and think. The rabbis put that very question in the mouth of Moses. God, you got a guy like Akiva, and you're letting him be martyred by the Romans. Really? A guy who's contributed so much. It also occurs to me, like, I'm doing Daf Yomi, which is a daily study of Talmud, and we just came across the passage that is connected to Lag BaOmer, which is coming up in like a week or two, right? And it's about Rabbi Akiva and his students, and they die. And why do they die? Because they're not nice to each other. But right, like, like this is Rabbi Akiva. He's got this huge number of students, and yet this is what happens to him. His students die. He dies. He's martyred. Why? Why would the world be like that? And Moses himself gets to ask God that question. According to the rabbis are fully aware of that question and grapple. As human beings, they have to be. All right, any concluding last minute thoughts, ideas, questions that you have? One last chance to ask any questions that you still have, because I'm sure somebody still has a question or more than one question. Yeah, Eileen.
In one of the passages we read, it talked about if two people study together, they're recorded in the book.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, and it's like somebody else said, that really reminded me of the Yom Kippur Book.
Absolutely.
Is it a book that's keeping a record? And why is it being kept a record? And what is it going to be used for?
It's a great question. Maybe it's used to, I think one of the ways that the rabbis grapple with the question of bad things happening in the world is precisely that there's this book, there's this record, and you may feel like you're being punished in this world, but you'll get a reward in the next world. So maybe the record is for that, for when you show up in the next world, and then they can open up your book and say, all right, you got a bum deal in the physical world, but you go right to Gan Eden, you go right to the Garden of Eden, go right ahead, right? Maybe that. Maybe it just becomes all part of that vast Torah, right? Which is both oral and written. And it's just whatever you did together, now it's part of Torah. Everything we just did today, that's now out there in Torah. Maybe that's right. But something about it being done together means that it gets recorded because now both of us have memories of it, right? In other words, whatever I said didn't just stay with me. You heard what I said. And like I said about my dissertation or about what happens when you write scholarly work. Now you'll take something I said and you'll make something else of it and you'll pass it on to another person. I'll take something you said and I'll incorporate it into the next time I teach these texts, right? Or the next time I teach my students, I'll incorporate it into something I write someday maybe, right? It'll all become, and maybe it's because of the sharing that it has the potential to leave just my head and go out into the world of Torah. Maybe that's what that means.
Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else? You can just jump right in at this point, I think.
There's an expression about if the tree falls in the forest and nobody hears it, did it really happen? But if somebody hears it, it's evidence. Mm-hmm. I can't remember the exact expression, but
no, but I think you're over. Like if I just sit in my study and I have a thought, maybe it never goes anywhere. But if I discuss it with my study partner,
you're sharing it,
right? Or if I write an article about it and I put that article in a journal or on a website and other people read it and think about it, then maybe, right? That the very sharing of something is what helps make it Torah, because then it goes out into the world. And right, and that's what God wants, and that's how God will be able to communicate to us through Torah. And that's how we'll find God in Torah.
And I wonder,
and share our questions about God and share our challenges and all the things that are hard and the things we don't understand too. Sorry, I cut somebody off there briefly.
Yeah, just one other thought. Sometimes, I don't know if you've happened to this, somebody will come back and say, you said something to me and I've never forgotten it, and it changed, and you have no idea what they've said, what you said to them.
Yeah.
So, and that could be a way, just, it's right place, right time,
exactly.
The right person.
Exactly. All right. Thank you all. I think I'm supposed to leave about, 5 or 10 minutes for just wrap up and any last business for the class. So I turn it back over. And thank you all so much.
Thank you, Rabbi. It was great.
Rabbi, thank you. It was so interesting to read the text. I'm not sure we've studied text before here, but really to dive into it.
Yeah. Thank you, Rabbi. It was really extraordinary. For some of us, we'd heard you before when we did the Talmud study about 2 years ago. So this was very interesting to see it in a little different way. That was a little more lecture, and this is a little more interactive. So it was nice to have it both ways.
Yeah.
So thank you.
It's a huge tradition, so there's always more stuff.
Oh, yeah.
So just a couple of notes, everybody. Next month, we're meeting on June 9th, and we're going to have our last in this cycle of what is God. And as Rabbi mentioned, we'll be talking about finding God through prayer. So that's next month. There's no reading for that from the textbooks, but I'll send out handouts before then. And then we're not meeting in July or August. So you get the summer off. And then during July and August, Alan and I, and we'll be working with others to really lock down our curriculum for next year and figure out what's going to happen at convention for your Benot Mitzvah. And to that end, we wanted to make sure that all of you have filled out the survey that came out from Edna. And if you didn't receive it in your email, it's going to be in Women's League Week. It will be in many places. Make sure that you fill that out so they can have an idea of who's coming to convention, who's interested, and that will help with our planning as well. So, and if for some reason you don't get that survey, just email us or email the office and they'll send it out to you, but only fill it out once because they can tell who's, they can tell if you've forgotten and then you send it again. But that will be really helpful. Ellen, anything else?
Yeah, we're going to change the structure of things a bit when we get into next year, just so that you know, because we have a lot of things that we have to go over with you as preparation for Bat Mitzvah, writing Divrei Torah, lots of other things. So there may be some smaller group meetings, there may be some larger group meetings, but it probably will be a little different schedule than one Thursday night a month. With all that in mind, we know that life happens, but we're asking you to really try not to miss a class. If you have to, one email to both of us, please, not just to Julia, because Julia ends up forwarding everything to me. And I know she's sending out the emails. This was her responsibility. It's fine, but there are both of us. So I'm asking you to please send it to both of us. But please try not to miss. We understand there are things that you cannot, you have to attend. We've got it. We're compassionate, understanding people. But at the same time, we're asking you, please try not to miss at the same time, wherever possible. At any rate, we are coming into the home stretch here. So this is really important. Lots of good things. We'll be working on trope. We'll be working on a lot of things that you need for that last year. So the schedule will change a little bit. We'll give you as much notice ahead of time, but that's our plan. While you have the summer off for July and August, we'll be working on that to kind of get that all taken care of and we'll have probably that first meeting, probably September, where we'll go through the whole schedule, because by then we'll have everything worked out. So just to let you know what's up the line. Next month, though, will be the last one in the conventional sense of things. Julia?
We do have dates assigned for, one Thursday a month for next year. And we actually do have some parts of our curriculum that we're going to finish up. And we have some guest rabbis assigned for some of the fall. So
right.
Some of it will continue, and we'll send those dates. I know somebody had asked for them for next year, and they are on the calendar. I just didn't have a list of them to send out. So we'll send those to you.
We'll get you everything as much in advance as we can. And Rabbi, FYI, we will probably be doing some Yehuda Amica as well. I'm a great follower of his poetry, and I love that stuff. So that's one of the things that we probably will do. He was known as Poet Laureate of Israel. So, that's in there. And it certainly, with some other poetry, we will do some of the things related to Israel, but in sort of a way that you'll get some of these most important things, but at the same time, we'll be prepping for bat mitzvah. Okay.
And we are going to take, I know we had asked you for what you were interested in doing at as part of the ceremony, and we are going to take that into account. We may not be able to do all of it just because we're limited by the time we have from the convention committee and from the other Women's League leadership. So, but we will try to fit in as much as we can. And my internet went out, and when I came back in, I lost my host ability, so I can't play our Debbie Friedman song at the end.
Hold on. I'm looking to see if I can make you a co-host.
You should be able to, but yeah, it just lost out. So anyway, it's okay. We can finish up and wish you all a good month and Shabbat Shalom.
Hold on, there. I just made you co-host.
Okay.
There you go. Now you can play us out.
You got it, Julia?
Yep, I got it.
Okay.
But it didn't work. Sorry, technology. Anyway, we'll get it the next time before the summer. But thank you, everyone. And Rabbi, if you'll stay on for a couple of minutes.
Will do.